Most dangerous attacks aren't shouted, they're whispered. How the sharpest blades in politics don't come out swinging. They slide in between the ribs while everyone's still smiling for the cameras. That's exactly what happened inside a Washington committee room the day Stacey Abrams thought she could question Jasmine Crockett's loyalty to her own people. The world saw a soundbite. I saw the moment a match hit gasoline. It started with one sentence, harmless to the untrained ear. Abrams, sitting polished and calm, remarked that as some of our black lawmakers have grown out of touch with the grassroots, she didn't name names, didn't have to. In a room like that, you can feel the crosshairs without seeing the laser. Those who know the game understood instantly. The words weren't aimed at the air, they were aimed at Crockett. Now, Crockett's no stranger to tension. She's a fighter, built from the grit of Dallas and Fort Worth streets, not the cocktail circuits of D.C. But what happened next wasn't just defense. It was the opening of a case file, the kind you don't want opened on you. She leaned forward, eyes locked on Abrams, and in a voice just loud enough for every microphone to catch, she asked, "Could you clarify who you're talking about?" That's the moment the room shifted. Cameras stopped panning. Staffers froze mid-note. Note. This wasn't going to be a vague exchange about policy differences. This was about identity. Credibility. The right to speak for your own people without having it stripped from you in front of the nation. The thing about Crockett's style, and it's what makes her dangerous in a room like that, is that she doesn't need to shout. Her voice carries like a slow drum beat. Every pause calculated, every word chosen to cut without fraying. She told Abrams in so many words that unless you've walked her streets, stood in her grocery store lines, buried the teenagers she's buried, you don't get to question her connection to her people. And in that instant, everyone knew this wasn't going to stay inside these walls. Sophie, the footage would go everywhere, and what was about to happen next would leave Congress stunned. You could feel it, the way the air got heavier, almost electric. In politics, silence is never just silence. It's the space where power decides which way it's going to break. It's going to break. Abrams looked up from her notes, calm on the surface, but with that flicker in her eyes. The kind you get when you realize the other person isn't going to let this pass. She gave the safe answer. I'm speaking generally. Oh, I'm speaking generally. But everyone in that room knew the truth. Generalities are the perfect weapon when you want to hit someone without ever naming them. And here's the thing most people don't understand. In D.C., perception is more dangerous than fact. If the perception spreads that you've lost touch with your own people, it doesn't matter how many bills you've passed or how many lives you've touched. Your political currency drops overnight. Abrams knew that. Crockett knew it too. Ooh, that's why the smile never cracked on Crockett's face, but her words started to get sharper. She painted a picture. Not theory, not campaign talking points, but raw, lived reality. People working 2 jobs, still begging the electric company to keep the lights on. Parents choosing between rent and insulin. Funerals for kids who never got the chance to vote. And while she spoke, something started to happen. The staffers in the back, the ones trained to half listen while scrolling their phones, stopped moving. Reporters who usually keep one eye on their laptops were now fully locked in. Even Abrams' own team behind her had gone still, as if they knew the temperature in the room had just climbed a few degrees. Crockett wasn't raising her voice. She didn't need to. The restraint was the blade. She leaned into the silence between her sentences, letting the weight of each one hang in the air. If that's what being out of touch looks like to you, she said, then maybe we're not having the same conversation. It wasn't just a rebuttal, it was a dare. The kind of line that forces the other person to either step back or step into the fire. Abrams, for a split second, hesitated. That hesitation told everyone in the room exactly how close this was to turning into a public political brawl. And then she made the mistake. She decided to keep swinging. Abrams' voice was steady when it came, but there was a shift, a calculated drop in tone, like a fencer leaning in for the thrust. I wasn't referring to you directly. Representative Crockett, she said. Shiva Ki. Then came the spark that set the tinder ablaze. But when the shoe fits, you could feel the collective inhale from the room. In political hearings, words are measured to the millimeter. That phrase wasn't an accident. It was a crack in the polished mask, deliberate enough to be heard, sharp enough to be remembered. A low murmur rippled through the crowd. Not outrage, not yet. Just recognition. Everyone knew this had moved past policy and into personal territory. Crockett tilted her head, almost studying Abrams the way a chess player studies an opponent who's just made an overly bold move. Her reply was calm, but there was a new edge in it. That's a bold thing to say in this room, in front of these cameras. Especially when my record is not just public, but lived. Notice something here. She didn't raise her volume, but the tension doubled anyway. That's the mark of a seasoned fighter. You let your opponent feel the ground shifting under them, without ever having to shout about it. The chairwoman leaned back, scanning both women like she was weighing whether to step in. But she didn't. This was too good, too real, to interrupt. Crockett pressed forward. Now let's be real here. Comments like that aren't made in a vacuum. They shape narratives and they give fuel to people already looking for a reason to dismiss what we do. She wasn't just defending herself. She was reframing Abrams' comment as a weapon that could be turned against all black lawmakers. Suddenly, it wasn't Crockett versus Abrams anymore. It was Abrams versus the integrity of the very movement she claimed to protect. That's when I realized something. Crockett wasn't just pushing back to save face. She was forcing Abrams into a corner where every defense would either look like retreat or escalation. And Abrams, pride unshaken, chose escalation. I've worked across this country, Abrams countered, with leaders at every level. I've seen the difference between those who stay rooted in the people's struggles and those who get comfortable in the Washington bubble. It's not personal. It's an observation. Observation. Harmless to the untrained ear. But to Crockett, it was a loaded shot. And the way she responded next was where the fire truly started. Crockett leaned forward, letting the word roll off her tongue like it was something she'd just picked up, turned over, and found wanting. Observation, she repeated, slow enough that the room could taste the skepticism. Well, here's one for you. My district doesn't have the luxury of observations. We deal with realities. She didn't blink. Didn't look at the cameras. She went straight into the kind of imagery that makes an argument unshakable. A people sleeping in cars. Parents rationing food so their kids can eat. Seniors deciding whether to pay rent or buy medicine. So, I didn't read those in a report, Miss Abrams. I've been in those homes. I've stood in those kitchens. And that's the moment the hearing shifted from policy theater to lived testimony. You could almost see the neighborhoods she was describing, feel the heat of a Texas summer in apartments with broken AC, smell the mildew in walls from leaks never fixed. This wasn't rhetoric. It was a tour of her reality, and Abrams was stuck in the passenger seat. The staffers along the back wall weren't even pretending to be distracted anymore. Phones were down, laptops closed halfway. The C-SPAN camera light stayed fixed on Crockett, the blinking red dot almost pulsing in time with her words. She was controlling the oxygen in the room now, and she knew it. Abrams kept her expression neutral, but if you watched closely, her jaw tightened. The kind of subtle tell you only catch if you've been in enough confrontations to know when someone's feeling the hit. Crockett wasn't done. That's what I carry into this room every single day. So when you say some of us are out of touch, I take that personally, because the people I represent don't have the luxury of being anyone's talking point. And there it was, the pivot. It's if it. She wasn't just defending her own record anymore. She was framing Abrams' comment as an insult to her entire district. That's how you win in these spaces. Make it about the people, not yourself. For a split second, the room felt smaller, like every person had been pulled in close. And Claude in close. And just as the chairwoman seemed ready to gavel it down, Crockett leaned back, almost smiling, as if to say, I'm not finished yet. Abrams adjusted the microphone, her voice dipping into that polished, careful tone politicians use when they know they've walked into a trap, but still think they can talk their way out. A Congresswoman Crockett, I certainly didn't mean to diminish your experience or the needs of your district. My observation was simply that, but Crockett was already shaking her head slowly, like she'd heard the I didn't mean preamble 1,000 times before and knew exactly where it was headed. See, that's the thing, Miss Abrams. You didn't mean to, but you did. And in my district, the consequences of words are just as real as the consequences of actions. There was a hum in the air, the kind that's not quite applause, but definitely not silence. People shifted forward in their seats. Staffers exchanged quick side glances. Abrams tried to continue, but Crockett cut in clean, no raise in volume, just precision. Because here's what happens, Crockett said, leaning forward, her hands now resting on the table like she was about to deal a winning hand of cards. You make a comment that suggests some of us are detached from reality. It gets clipped into a 10-second soundbite. And in that 10 seconds, my constituents, the people who've trusted me with their voices, hear you saying their struggles aren't real, and you know who loves that? The folks who'd rather we argue with each other than fight for them. The chairwoman didn't stop her. No one did. Crockett's voice had shifted into that low, steady register that's impossible to interrupt without looking like you're trying to hide from the truth. You've got power, Miss Abrams, Crockett continued, eyes locked in. And whether you like it or not, every word you speak from that seat shapes the public's trust. Maybe instead of making observations, we start making commitments? Commitments to the people. Commitments that don't disappear once the cameras turn off. By now, Abrams wasn't nodding. She was still, completely still. And Crockett let the silence stretch, because silence in the right hands is as devastating as any line of questioning. Finally, she leaned back, letting the weight of her words linger in the air like the final note of a song that everyone knows will be stuck in their head for days. And that's when the shift happened. The audience realized this wasn't just a defense. It was a dismantling. Abrams cleared her throat, her fingers tapping against the table, a nervous tick that even the cameras couldn't miss. She forced a polite smile, the kind that's supposed to suggest confidence, but instead hinted at desperation. Well, Congresswoman, I suppose we can agree that our methods might differ, but our goals. Crockett didn't even let the sentence finish. She leaned in just enough to close the space, her voice dropping into a near whisper that somehow carried across the entire room. Miss Abrams' goals without integrity are just speeches. The words landed like a gavel strike. The audience didn't cheer, but you could feel the electricity. Someone in the back gasped softly. Even the committee stenographer paused for half a second before catching up. Abrams' eyes darted down to her notes, maybe searching for a prepared line, maybe just avoiding the unflinching stare Crockett had locked on her. Crockett wasn't smiling. She wasn't grandstanding. She wasn't grandstand. She was holding the moment like a surgeon with a scalpel. Precise, deliberate, and with no wasted movement. You see, Crockett continued, voice steady, my community doesn't have the luxury of symbolic wins. They need results, real ones. So when someone in your position uses their platform to, how should I put this, critique those of us in the trenches, you're not just talking to me, you're talking to them. And I promise you, they're listening. Fritter, this. Abrams opened her mouth, but Crockett raised a single finger. Not to silence her, but to signal that she wasn't done. So here's my challenge. Don't tell me what you think I'm doing wrong. Show me what you're willing to do right. Stand next to me in my district. Walk those streets. Walk those streets. Talk to those families. And if you can still look them in the eye after the things you said, then maybe we can have a real conversation about strategy. It wasn't a rant. It wasn't a performance. It was an invitation, the kind that feels less like an open door and more like a test you already know most people will fail. By the time Crockett leaned back, Abrams had nothing left. No rebuttal, no recovery, just the sound of papers shuffling, cameras clicking, and the unmistakable realization that this exchange was going to be replayed, dissected, and remembered far beyond the walls of that hearing room. The clip hit the internet before the meeting had even adjourned. A staffer's phone, angled perfectly over the committee table, had caught every word of Crockett's calm dismantling of Abrams. The steady voice, the scalpel-sharp phrasing, the finger in the air that stopped a political heavyweight mid-sentence. Woo. At first, it circulated quietly. A few political bloggers, some activist Twitter accounts, but then one journalist with nearly 1 million followers posted it with a single caption. This is how you check someone without breaking a sweat. Within an hour, it was everywhere. Clipped versions popped up on TikTok with captions like a Crockett didn't come to play, and a this is how you win without yelling. Instagram reels layered it over dramatic music, slowing the moment Crockett leaned forward, eyes locked on Abrams, until it felt almost cinematic. By nightfall, hashtags like #CrockettChallenge and #Goals with Integrity were trending. Even people outside politics, athletes, actors, business leaders, started sharing the moment as a masterclass in composure and clarity under pressure. Meanwhile, cable news producers scrambled. By the 9 p.m. hour, The exchange was on a split screen. Crockett on one side, Abrams on the other, with pundits analyzing every eyebrow twitch, every pause. On one channel, a commentator marveled. She dismantled her without raising her voice. That's rare in politics today. On another, someone warned, Abrams underestimated Crockett, and this is what happens when you forget who you're dealing with. And yet, behind the scenes, the real story was brewing. A leaked memo from Abrams' team revealed panic, a bullet point list of damage control strategies, ranging from a carefully worded apology to a possible joint appearance with Crockett to show unity. But the memo's last line said it all. Do not engage directly again, without preparation. Crockett, on the other hand, didn't post a word about it. No victory lap. No self-congratulation. She simply showed up at a community food drive the next morning as if nothing had happened. Cameras followed her there too, but she didn't stop to address them. It was the silence that made it louder. In a political world addicted to noise, Crockett's refusal to gloat was the one move that ensured the moment would keep growing. By the next morning, the damage to Abrams' image was no longer just an internet storm. It was bleeding into the circles that actually kept her political machine running. Calls from donors, once a steady stream of support, turned into cautious check-ins laced with hesitation. Some asked polite but pointed questions. Do you think maybe you came off too aggressive? Others skipped the pleasantries entirely. Why did you go after Crockett? It wasn't a good look. That's a good look. In politics, you can survive critics, but when your friends start asking questions, that's when the cracks spread fastest. Behind closed doors, a quiet shift was happening. Influential figures who had once aligned themselves tightly with Abrams began making subtle moves, liking Crockett's posts, praising her speeches in unrelated interviews, or casually mentioning her leadership style in the same breath as words like a refreshing and a strategic act. It was the kind of repositioning that could be denied if called out, but everyone in Washington knew exactly what it meant. People were hedging their bets. Meanwhile, Crockett's moment of discipline, her refusal to ride the wave of public praise, was working like a magnet. The more she stayed focused on her work, the more the media filled in the gaps for her, framing her as the composed truth-teller in an era of political chaos. Columnists started writing think pieces with titles like The Art of the Political Counterpunch and A. Crockett's Silence Speaks Louder Than Words. But Abrams wasn't sitting still. Her team quietly reached out to producers, pitching her for softer interviews, ones that would let her pivot back to her policy work. The problem was, every host wanted to ask about one thing, that moment. And no matter how much she tried to redirect, clips of her deflections only made the exchange feel fresher. Even worse for Abrams, local radio hosts in her own base began weighing in. Some defended her, others called the confrontation unnecessary, but the damage was the same. Crockett's name was now in every conversation where Abrams had once gone unchallenged. Some defend. The tide wasn't fully against Abrams yet, but in politics, perception moves faster than truth. And right now, perception was that she had been outplayed, outclassed, and outmaneuvered by someone she never thought could touch her. By the next morning, the damage to Abrams' image was no longer just an internet storm. It was bleeding into the circles that actually kept her political machine running. Calls from donors, once a steady stream of support, turned into cautious check-ins, laced with hesitation. Some asked polite but pointed questions. Do you think maybe you came off too aggressive? Others skipped the pleasantries entirely. Why did you go after Crockett? It wasn't a good look. In politics, you can survive critics. But when your friends start asking questions, that's when the cracks spread fastest. Behind closed doors, a quiet shift was happening. Influential figures who had once aligned themselves tightly with Abrams began making subtle moves, liking Crockett's posts, praising her speeches in unrelated interviews, or casually mentioning her leadership style in the same breath as words like irrefreshing and strategic. It was the kind of repositioning that could be denied if called out, but everyone in Washington knew exactly what it meant. People were hedging their bets. Meanwhile, Crockett's moment of discipline, her refusal to ride the wave of public praise, was working like a magnet. The more she stayed focused on her work, the more the media filled in the gaps for her, framing her as the composed truth-teller in an era of political chaos. Columnists started writing think pieces with titles like The Art of the Political Counterpunch and Why Crockett's Silence Speaks Louder Than Words, but Abrams wasn't sitting still. Her team quietly reached out to producers, pitching her for softer interviews, ones that would let her pivot back to her policy work. The problem was, every host wanted to ask about one thing, that moment. And no matter how much she tried to redirect, clips of her deflections only made the exchange feel fresher. Even worse for Abrams, local radio hosts in her own base began weighing in. Some defended her, others called the confrontation unnecessary, but the damage was the same. Crockett's name was now in every conversation where Abrams had once gone unchallenged. The tide wasn't fully against Abrams yet, but in politics, perception moves faster than truth. And right now, perception was that she had been outplayed, outclassed, and outmaneuvered by someone she never thought could touch her. Abrams' advisors knew the slow bleed couldn't continue. In politics, you either own the story or the story owns you. So they crafted a high-risk plan, a primetime interview on a national news network, billed as a clarification of the events. The pitch was simple. Abrams would come across as poised, measured, and above the fray. Measured and above the fray. She'd use the moment to refocus the conversation on her legislative wins and reclaim the moral high ground. The stage was set. Lights, camera, controlled environment. The interviewer, a seasoned host known for soft landings, began with warm, almost sympathetic questions. Abrams leaned into it, her voice calm, her tone deliberate. For a moment, it seemed like the strategy might work. Then, about 12 minutes in, the host leaned forward and asked, almost casually, "Some have said your comments about Congresswoman Crockett weren't just political criticism. They were personal attacks. Do you regret them?" It was the kind of question you could skate past with one sentence. But Abrams hesitated, just long enough for viewers to notice, and then made the mistake her team had feared. She doubled down. "I spoke the truth," she said, a faint smile tugging at her lips. "If someone can't handle the heat of honest critique, maybe they're in the wrong profession." It was meant to sound confident. Instead, it landed like a slap. Within minutes, clips of the remark were sliced, captioned, and shared across every major platform. Political analysts didn't even need to weigh in. The public reaction was immediate. The comment reinforced everything her critics had been saying, that Abrams wasn't just disagreeing with Crockett. She was trying to diminish her. The next morning's headlines were brutal. Abrams burns bridge in live interview, a doubling down or digging deeper. Crockett stays silent as rival self-destructs, and through it all, Crockett said nothing. No press release, no pointed tweet, no sly interview comment. She just kept showing up to work, letting the moment breathe, and in that silence, she looked stronger. By the end of the week, polling in key districts showed something Abrams had never seen before. Its approval rating among Abrams' own supporters had climbed. The silence had stretched for nearly 2 weeks, and in Washington, that kind of restraint is a weapon. Crockett knew it. By letting Abrams' words echo without rebuttal, she allowed the public to form their own verdict. And they had. The tide had turned, but Crockett wasn't interested in just winning the news cycle. The room was packed with reporters, policy aides, and more cameras than usual. Because by now, everyone was waiting for Crockett's first real move. She arrived in her usual understated style, dark blazer, hair neatly pulled back, not a hint of spectacle. But when it was her turn to speak, she didn't launch into policy points. Instead, she reached into her folder and pulled out a single sheet of paper. "This," she said calmly, "is a bipartisan resolution I've co-sponsored, calling for enhanced protections for whistleblowers and community advocates. It's about ensuring that voices, even unpopular ones, are heard without fear of retaliation or personal attack." The room went still. She hadn't said Abrams' name. She hadn't mentioned the interview. But the implication hung in the air like a storm cloud. Crockett was framing herself as the protector of free speech, civility, and dignity, everything Abrams' remarks had undercut. Reporters scribbled furiously. Cameras zoomed in, and just when it seemed she might walk away, Crockett looked up and delivered the final surgical cut. "In this chamber, we debate ideas. We don't diminish the people who bring them forward. No raise in tone, no dramatic pause, just a fact dropped into the record." Within an hour, her words were trending nationwide. Not as a counterattack, but as a statement of principle. Influencers clipped it, Political commentators called it a masterclass in restraint, and late-night hosts replayed it alongside Abrams' smirk from The Interview. The contrast was devastating. By the weekend, donors were shifting their contributions. Endorsements were being reconsidered. And in back rooms across the Capitol, the quiet consensus emerged. Abrams had lost control of the narrative, and Crockett had claimed it without throwing a single punch. It was proof of an old political truth. Sometimes the most powerful move is not the loudest, but the one that leaves your opponent talking, and you simply winning.